This is Based Vampirification, a Not Quite Dead audio essay. Hi, I'm Aira, creator of Not Quite Dead and the voice of both Alfie and Nej, and I love vampires, which you can probably tell from the fact that I've made an entire show about them. This is a little essay-ish type thing which discusses the vampire media which inspired my vampire obsessions, and the queer themes I have read into that media. I have put a little reading list together for some things that you might want to look at as a small jumping off point if you're interested in exploring this topic further in a more literary way, and I've left that in the description for this episode. I wanted to start off by talking about my first experiences of vampires in media. To my memory, my first exposure to vampires was through Sibella Dracula, the character in the 1988 made-for-TV movie Scooby-Doo and the Ghoul School. She's an odd character. Given that she's meant to be a child, it's strange that they give her this almost sultry-sounding voice. I was fascinated with her when I was a kid, and I liked her stupid puns. I also enjoyed Mona the Vampire a lot as a kid, and I read a few novels with vampire characters in them, but my real obsession with vampires probably started when I was about 7, and I started watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The vampires in Buffy absolutely captivated me. I liked that they looked beautiful right until the moment that they were about to bite. As an adult reflecting on this, I actually really love this as a metaphor for the way that violence, and especially sexual violence, tends to work in society. We think that we can spot people who are most a threat to us, but they don't actually look any different from anyone else. They just look like ordinary people, and you only realise you're at risk until it's far, far too late. I also liked that despite being destined to kill vampires, most of Buffy's significant love interests were vampires. Her duty is to kill in order to serve her community and the world. It's a huge and significant burden upon her. She doesn't have time to date. It makes perfect sense then that her relationships end up being essentially office romances with the very creatures that she's supposed to be wiping out. Combining these two aspects scratches a particular itch in my head. Vampires are necessarily violent. The way they eat is consumption with all the layers of distance and propriety scrubbed away. They feed from living creatures, drinking sustenance directly from them. The places that vampires bite are extremely intimate because they're some of our most vulnerable points. The throat is the most exposed. This is the most classic location that vampires are shown to bite from. Fear of vampires, then, is a fear of both violence, in the biting, the sucking, the draining of blood, and of intimacy, in the pushing of a part of one body into the flesh of another, the touch of lips against vulnerable places, the surrender of will and agency. For Buffy specifically, we can think of her attraction towards Angel as representing her desire both for freedom from duty, but also for surrender. One of the most notable things about Buffy is that she's incredibly strong. She can easily match a vampire in a fight, and fights with non-magical creatures are extremely easy for her. She walks through life unable to be harmed by it. The only time she's really physically vulnerable is when she's fighting vampires, and even then, to really be at their mercy requires a kind of surrender from her. I don't think you can have intimacy without some kind of vulnerability. I think that goes for all kinds of intimacy too, not just sexual intimacy. Buffy's vampire fighting is also working as a metaphor for her obligations to her community and the expectations the world has of her as a young woman. She's supposed to have a great relationship with her mum, to do well in school, to have good friends, to set up for a life in college. But how can she do all of that when she's fighting vampires all the time? This is kind of how it felt for me, just being an adolescent, even though I wasn't fighting any vampires. Everyone and everything seemed to have all these expectations of who I should be and how I should go about that, and very little understanding of who I actually was and what the day-to-day reality of my existence was like. Buffy's attraction to Angel, and later to Spike, serves as this very direct way of talking about her emergent sexuality, how that runs parallel to and against all of these obligations and duties that she has. Through that discussion, it touches on some incredibly queer themes. The most obvious of these to me is that Buffy is not supposed to be attracted to vampires. Her initial response to realising that she even has the capacity for that attraction is horror. Angel is a whole, nuanced person with interests and doubts and feelings, and this totally floors Buffy. And through her attraction to him, she's able to perceive his personhood. These are monsters, they're not intimate partners, but she doesn't want to stake Angel, she wants to kiss him. Of course she's upset that she likes him. She ought to want him dead. So any of my fellow LGBTQ+ folks who grew up in communities or environments which weren't very accepting of queer identities, you may have been raised to think that LGBTQ+ people are just as monstrous as Buffy believes the vampires to be. Realising that you may be queer in the context of all of that fear and hatred is complex, not just because you're deviating from the norm, but because you've been villainising people who are like yourself. It's a realisation not just that you're different, but that you're other. What's interesting in Buffy specifically is that the two vampires who are treated as love interests are each in their own ways exceptional. Angel has, through long suffering, come to restore his emotional capacity to a pre-vampire-like state. Spike has received medical interventions which prevent him from exacting violence against humans without feeling an intense pain. Neither Angel nor Spike represents the vampire population at large then. Although Buffy is forced to confront the personhood of both of them because she's attracted to them, it doesn't mean that she then has to reckon with the personhood of vampires more generally. The reason for that is because this is a show about killing vampires, and it would significantly alter the show's premise if we as an audience were forced to consider the personhood of every single one of the vampires every time that Buffy has to kill them. It would also be extremely psychologically damaging for her as a person who is destined to kill vampires if every time she did so, she would have to recognise the full personhood and autonomy of every single one of them. I can see why the show did not go in this direction. It would have been a very different kind of show, but alas. The fact that Buffy is only attracted to Angel and Spike then does some interesting things to the way that we read this as an allegory for queerness. It's kind of troubling to think that Buffy can only really see personhood in the people that she's attracted to, and it feels like it bears a relationship to the idea of being the only good queer person. None of this is intentional. This is an issue that emerges when you read it as a queer allegory. This brings us fairly neatly to the next vampires in my list of obsessions. The Cullens from Twilight. I got into Twilight in late 2006. The second book had already released, but the series was yet to become the cultural phenomenon we know it as today. That wouldn't really start until 2007, and when I first got into the series, I was the only one of my friends who knew what it was. I read the first book and was immediately obsessed. I remember absolutely sobbing at the final chapter when Edward refuses to turn Bella. My heart absolutely ached about it, and I was furious. To call my feelings about Twilight love is a bit of a misnomer though. Even in my early readings of it, I found myself deeply critical of the text and the writing. I'd spent my childhood reading a lot of Dickens, and I could tell that this wasn't quote-unquote good literature. Nevertheless, I was obsessed. It was like someone had peeled out the bits of Buffy that I loved the most and written a book just exclusively about them. I had not felt so completely consumed by a book before. The thing you need to understand about Twilight is that Bella Swan is just totally and completely obsessed with Edward Cullen. He's a creep, a total stalker, an absolute freak, and many people have discussed this at length, so I don't feel the need to do so again here. And I really want to think about Bella and her own obsessive weirdness, because I feel like that's so rarely discussed, and I need to discuss it. Bella Swan is an absolute fucking weirdo. She sees this boy, right, and she's like, oh, he's hot. And then she realises he doesn't like her for whatever reason, and this gets stuck in her brain. Stuck like a little grain of sand in an oyster. She's wrapping it in layers and layers and layers of thoughts going over and over and over it in her head. She cannot stop thinking about this boy. Why? Why? What is it about him? He doesn't even like her. Does she like him? Her thoughts on a crush. There's something else. Bella's first dream about Edward comes the night after he saves her life. This is that dream. In my dream, it was very dark, and what dim light there was seemed to be radiating from Edward's skin. I couldn't see his face, just his back as he walked away from me, leaving me in the blackness. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't catch up to him. No matter how loud I called, he never turned. That is not an ordinary high school girl's dream about her crush. She doesn't dream of kissing him, of holding his hand, of having sex with him. She dreams of him as a cold and distant figure, the one solid thing in a world of nothingness, which is where he leaves her. She sees him as fundamentally other, but rather than revulsion or horror, she longs to reach for him. Bella doesn't objectify Edward in the sense that we usually use that word. She isn't sexualizing him, and indeed, although they kiss, it's not until the third book, after their separation and reunion, that Bella thinks about having sex with Edward at all, really. It's almost like her attraction to him as a sexual partner is entirely secondary to her attraction to him as a thing, as an other, as, specifically, a vampire. This is heightened for me by Bella's desire to become a vampire herself. Although her self-justification for this is that she doesn't want to be vulnerable and human anymore, her real motivations are plain in the text. She wants to be a vampire, so she is more beautiful, so she doesn't age, so she can be more like Edward. Therein, within that impulse, that need to have Edward, but to, in a sense, become him, that is what made me so weirdly obsessed with Twilight. I remember as a young person having these odd, desperate longing feelings for the boys in my class. I didn't like them or have a crush on them. I had felt that too, and it was different. This longing that I was feeling felt very near to hate, but it wasn't that either. I can look back as an adult and pretty reliably identify those feelings as envy. I wanted to be them, and I resented them for everything that they were that I wasn't. This screams out of Twilight for me in Bella's attraction to Edward, and in particular those moments where she's describing interacting with him in proximity. She focuses on the hardness of his body in comparison to the softness of her own, his measured temper with bright bursts of rage in comparison to her own more moderate moods. She's interested in Edward because of what he is, that she emphatically isn't. Bella envies Edward. This is not just a story about a high school girl in love with a vampire to me. This is, to me, a story about a high school girl who wants to be a fucking monster, and that I can empathise with. I never had much interest for the teen vampire romances that followed Twilight to the YA section of bookshops because they emphasised the part of the story which had compelled me the least, and I missed that yearning to become, which is for me such a crucial part of what Twilight is. From Twilight, I pivoted into much more grown-up vampire stories, beginning with the film versions of Dracula and Interview with the Vampire, and then the novel versions of both. Of the vampires in Dracula, only the Count himself is truly a cognizant agent. The wives are near feral. This fascinated me. I enjoyed how Anne Rice's vampires lingered on the act of blood drinking as inherently intimate, lingering on the sexual connotations of penetrating another one's skin. The intoxicating toxicity of Louis and Lestat's envy of and lust for each other, like a snake devouring itself. They want each other, but they hate each other, and it's delicious. In both cases, Dracula and Interview, we can read the vampire as representing repressed sexuality in a similar way to that we see in Twilight and Buffy, but rather than being the emergent, vulnerable longing of an adolescent girl who is coming of age in a world where sexual predation is considered a livable reality rather than a reprehensible and morally repugnant horror, in Dracula and Interview, primarily we focus on the sexuality of men. In Dracula, we also explore Mina and Lucy's sexualities too, and I think it's interesting to think about the nature of their relationships given that Dracula is written 3 decades after the novel Carmilla. But, precisely because of that, it's fascinating to me that we begin the journey into the world of vampires through Jonathan Harker. Notably, Jonathan, unlike Bella, is primarily the object of desire, the desiree rather than the desirer, if you will. There are lots of reasons for this. It's important to frame Jonathan as a victim to Dracula's affections. The attraction of another man is pressed upon him, he does not seek it out. Notable too, however, is Jonathan's extremely modern attitudes to marriage and women. To readers now, it might escape your notice that his thoughts on tasting paprika handle is to get the recipe to give it to Mina, but the fact that he's considering her work in the household in this way would have stood out to readers contemporary to the novel's release. He's also enthusiastic about Mina's skills as a typist and not worried about how her interests might impede on her ability to be a good wife. All of that is very forward-thinking for a Victorian gentleman, and these are in fact examples of Jonathan Harker performing his masculinity in a very non-typical kind of way. After he falls victim to Dracula, Jonathan is extremely weakened. He's frail, frightened and diminished, and he's allowed to be. He's not derided for this state by the text or by those around him, at least not beyond thinking that it's kind of sad. Nobody implies he's less of a man for being weakened, and this is interesting in the context of this being a Victorian novel. This is all worth mentioning, even though, of course, the idea that queer men are lesser or weaker than our cis heterosexual counterparts is bullshit. But people still struggle to understand that in the broader culture now in 2024. Those ideas were even more prominent at the turn of the last century, over which Dracula was being written. Further from that, in Interview with the Vampire, we are meant to sympathise with the weaker, more submissive Louis, rather than Lestat. Although Lestat may be more flamboyant and overtly camp, he is also more violent, less remorseful and less considerate, all things which are stereotypically associated with masculinity. Louis, by contrast, cares about reading, about parenthood, about feelings. These are all more stereotypically feminine traits. Undoubtedly, though, it's Louis we're meant to empathise with, Louis who we are meant to see as morally superior. I think the real tragedy of Louis as a character is in how he is different from Bella. He is attracted to Lestat primarily through desire, through lust. He doesn't yearn to be like him. He doesn't want to be a vampire, he just wants to fuck one. But Lestat can't imagine anyone not wanting to be just like him because he thinks he's the best thing that's ever existed. I could go on about this relationship, but I won't. In all of these stories, the vampires and the people they interact with, they can be read as deeply queer. It is, to me, an essential part of what vampires are and what they do. It is both beautiful and fascinating to me. Once I got to this point in my obsession, I slipped sideways into more strange vampire stories, like Carmilla and Let the Right Ones In, and More and Beyond. It was around this time that I started working on my own vampires, which would eventually end up being represented in Not Quite Dead. I loved Underworld's gesturing at the science of vampire bodies, but found it frustratingly lacking in detail. I love the implications of something like He Is Legend, but found aspects of its myth-making to be frustratingly limited in scope. I like the explorations of queerness and adolescence presented in something like The Moth Diaries, but ultimately found myself dissatisfied with its ambiguity. I have talked, and will again, at length about my vampires, the mechanics of them, and how I developed those traits. For now though, this is the end of this little audio essay. I hope you enjoyed coming on this little journey through the vampire stories that make Not Quite Dead what it is. I'm looking forward to bringing you the Q&A next week. Until then, live, laugh, bite.